Hello, beauties. We are reading The Bridge to Belle Island. We're on chapter 2 now. The officer from Bow Street arrived. With so many crimes in London and not enough runners to go around, not every death warranted an investigating officer, and many crimes went unanswered for, unless a victim or interested party hired a runner at their own expense. But Percival Norris was connected to both a wealthy family and a well-known law firm, so a magistrate had quickly assigned a man to the case. The officer first spent time behind closed doors with the coroner and the deceased, then joined those waiting in the parlor. "Officer Riley of Bow Street," Constable Buxton announced, and gave the names of the assembled servants: Mrs. Kittleson, the housekeeper, Marvin, the manservant, and Mary Williams, the housemaid. He did not introduce Benjamin or Mr. Hardy. Ben took the opportunity to study the officer, not having made his acquaintance before. He was in his mid-30s, with brown hair, ghostly white skin, prominent ears, and a long neck. Bow Street runners were reputedly well-skilled, well-trained, and cunning, but this small man, did not seem to fit the image, and in fact reminded him of a weasel. Apparently, noticing the constable's omission, the officer turned to Mr. Hardy and Benjamin and asked in a working-class accent, "And who are you gents?" Hardy answered for them both: "Robert Hardy and Benjamin Booker, of Norris, Hardy and Hunt." The officer's eyebrows rose, and he barely concealed a smirk. "Ah, the bamboozled Booker, the Benish Ben. I heard about you." Benjamin clenched his jaw. Embarrassment heated his neck to be called such names in front of his superior, as well as several strangers. Though Benish was slang for foolish, Ben had never had reason to dislike his given name, until now. The officer's hooded eyes twinkled. "The comely defendant threw dust in your eyes, didn't she?" he chuckled. "Told you a plumper, I'd wager, and you swallowed her faradiddles whole." Benjamin fisted his hand. He felt Mr. Hardy's warning touch on his arm as he gently reminded the Bow Street runner, "A man has been killed, Officer Riley." "Right, just so." The officer turned a page in his small notebook, shaking his head, a smile still playing about his mouth. Then he sobered and asked, "And what brought you two here tonight?" Benjamin explained. "We met at the Queen's Head, and as we often do, and we were walking home together when we heard the night watchman shout, so we hurried over to see if we might help." The officer's thin lips quirked. "How civil of you! How selfless! No hope of sniffing out a wealthy new client or lucrative lawsuit?" "None at all." "Do you know the victim?" Hardy nodded. "Percival Norris was a founding member of our law firm. He has mostly retired over the last few years, and as his duties to the Wilder estate consumed too much of his time." The housemaid rolled her eyes at this, but no one besides Benjamin seemed to notice. Officer Riley turned to the trio of servants clustered near the hearth: the teary housekeeper, stoic elderly manservant, and sharp-faced housemaid. He started with the housekeeper, who had discovered the body. "Do you get on with your master?" "He weren't my master, not really. Miss Rose Lawrence is my mistress now, and before her grandfather, Mr. Wilder, God rest his soul. Mr. Norris was only here as trustee and as Miss Rose's guardian." "You didn't like him, I gather." "I did not." Mrs. Kittleson glanced at the manservant. "I think only Marvin liked him." The elderly man answered in a raspy voice, "I liked him well enough. Shared a glass with me from time to time, and paid my wages. Not my place to say anything against him." The officer turned to the young housemaid, brows expectantly high and notebook open. She supplied, I have only been here about a year. I just do my work and keep my head down. The manservant grunted. Keep your ear to the door, more like. The officer ignored this and asked, No sign of forced entry, is that right? That's right, the housekeeper replied. I'm afraid we left the back door unlocked. It opens into the garden, you see, not onto a public street. We've done the same for years. I never thought. Again, tears filled her eyes, and she pressed a handkerchief to each in turn. Did you see or hear anyone enter? She shook her head. You'll have to ask Mary. Marvin and I were not here. We left around 4 o'clock for a party at the Adair's, just up York Street. Mr. Norris gave us leave to go, the one kind gesture he ever made. Our own Miss Rose was celebrating her engagement, you see. Incredulity twisted the officer's mouth. You and Marvin were invited to a party in this neighborhood? Not as guests, but I am acquainted with the cook there and offered to help her. She was thankful and invited us to join them below stairs for a bit of supper, even cake and champagne. We peeked in at the door and saw a girl in all her finery. She never looked prettier, and so like her departed mother, God rest her soul. Again the woman dabbed her eyes. I'm so sorry about my bad British accent. I take it Miss Lawrence has yet to return? That's right. Then I'll question her later. The officer turned to the housemaid. But first, were you here all evening, miss? Now. Where were you? The girl shrugged. Out with my beau, if you must know. The old man gave us the evening off. I wasn't about to waste it slaving for some toffs. The housekeeper frowned. Mind your tongue, Mary. That's no way to speak of your betters. No betting me, and in the old man's case, worse. He got what was coming to him, I say. What you mean by that? Riley asked. Again the disrespectful shrug. Only that it couldn't have been happened to a more deserving chap. The young constable spoke up. A thief, I'd say, taking advantage of the locked door. All was quiet, so he slipped into the house, thinking to help himself to a few valuables, only to startle Mr. Norris into grabbing his gun. Several robberies into the area lately. Riley considered, then asked, Is anything missing from this office? The housekeeper shook her head. Not that I noticed, though I wouldn't know about his papers and such. And elsewhere in the house? A few pieces of silver seem to be missing, a pitcher and 2 candelabras that I've discovered so far. I shall have to recount the inventories. Yes, please do, Riley said. There's a broken glass on the office floor. Had Mr. Norris thrown glasses in the past? Perhaps when foxed? No, sir, Mrs. Kittleson replied. The housemaid added, Though he shouts and rails at us when he's vexed, sober or not. And now you mention it, I did hear a glass shatter on my way out, but I didn't wait around to be told to clean it up. I was dressed for a night on the town, and my beau was waiting. I see. I will need the gentleman's name to verify your whereabouts. Mary snorted. Gentleman. Ha! That's a good one. I'll tell him you said so. What a law. The officer frowned at that and wrote the man's name and direction in his notebook. Benjamin spoke up. I noticed the decanter on his desk was empty. We were out of Hollands, the manservant explained. I had not yet, bought more. The coroner smelled oranges on the deceased's person, Benjamin continued. The housekeeper's face puckered in confusion. I served him no oranges. No orange wine? Marvin seemed to hesitate. Well, there was wine and... He preferred gin, the housekeeper cut in. Though in a pinch he might drink most anything. Is that not right, Marvin? Holding her gaze a moment, Marvin slowly nodded. That's right. Again the old man hesitated. Is there a wine bottle in the room? No. Ah, well then. He shrugged his bony shoulders. I must be mistaken. Mistaken about what? Benjamin wondered. But the officer scribbled something in his notebook and moved on to another topic. An obvious question is who will benefit from Mr. Norris's death. Who is his heir? When the servants exchanged befuddled looks, Mr. Hardy said, I believe Miss Lawrence's maiden aunt, Isabel Wilder, was originally listed as heir, being his closest relative, although Percival may have changed his will through a different attorney. I could look through his papers for you if you'd like. The officer replied coolly, I will search 'em myself, thank you. Hardy said, I understand, but you did ask. Officer Riley scratched his ear, frowning with uncertainty. They will probably be so much legal nonsense to me. I suppose it will do no harm after the coroner is through in there, but you must let me know if you find anything related to his death. Of course, that is the point after all. The officer looked up, pencil poised. And where is this Isabel Wilder now? Mrs. Kittleson replied, Belle Island, the Wilder family's country estate in Berkshire. Has she been here recently? Bless me, no, the housekeeper exclaimed. Miss Isabel hasn't come up to London in years. What a notion! The officer turned back to Mr. Hardy. Any reason to suspect this Miss Wilder beyond the inheritance? Before Hardy could answer, the parlor door burst open, and a young woman in formal evening gown swept into the room, pale silk swirling around her ankles, light brown hair arranged high atop her head. Startled to find a crowd inside, she took a step backward, colliding with the young man behind her. He reached out both hands to steady her, his concerned gaze lingering on her profile before sweeping over the rest of the room. After him, an older woman in black entered. Miss Lawrence's maid or governess, Benjamin guessed. What is going on here? The gentleman asked. Dressed in dark evening attire, he was slight and freckled and nearly as pretty as his companion. Ignoring him, Officer Riley asked, Miss Lawrence? Yes, the young woman replied, and this is my intended, Mr. Adair, and Miss O'Toole. Noticing the senior partner, she said, Oh, good evening, Mr. Hardy. I did not see you there. Come to visit Uncle Percy? Not this time. He paused and added gently, I am afraid he is dead, my dear. Her gloved hand flew to her mouth. Oh, no. In his sleep? Hardy shook his head. In his office. The officer had added, He's been killed. By an intruder, perhaps. Killed? Her dark eyes widened. While we were at the party? Mr. Adair said, How tragic. Tears filled the young woman's eyes. Uncle Percy ought to have come with us. I told him he ought to come. Miss Lawrence shook her head. To be attacked here in our own home. Did someone shoot him, or? Bludgeoned, the officer replied. Miss Lawrence winced, then asked, Was he inebriated? We're not sure. Why? I suppose I am hoping he died unaware, without pain. Mr. Adair said coolly, In Mr. Norris's case, I think drunkenness is a fairly safe assumption. The officer said, The coroner smelled no gin on the man, only oranges, though the housekeeper maintains she served him none of those. Rose glanced over her shoulder at the young man. A look passed between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but he grasped her arm, forestalling her. Scribbling in his notebook the officer did not notice, but Benjamin and Mr. Hardy certainly did, and shared a significant look of their own. Now, think back, the officer said. Did any of you hear or see anything that might be helpful? The housemaid stepped forward. I did hear him arguing with some fellow before I left the house, but I didn't stand at the door and listen, contrary to what some might think of me." She jerked a thumb toward the manservant. "Was this before or after you heard a glass shatter?" "Just before." "Do you know who he was arguing with?" The maid's gaze darted across the room, then back again. No, sir. Never heard his name mention a name." Had she glanced at Mr. Adair, or had Benjamin imagined it? Unaware, the officer turned next to the dignified older woman in immaculate black. "Are you a maid here as well?" The woman stiffened. "I am Miss Lawrence's former governess, and present companion and chaperone." "Ah, and had you anything against Percival Norris?" "I did not like the way he treated my young mistress, but beyond that, no." Officer Riley looked from person to person. "Do you know anyone who had reason to hurt Mr. Norris, to want to see him dead?" Around the room furtive looks were exchanged. Finally Miss Lawrence spoke up. "Only me, I suppose." "Rose?" Mr. Adair cautioned under his breath. "Why not? The servants will tell all anyway. I'd rather he hear it from me." She turned back to Officer Riley. "I was angry with him, that is no secret. He put obstacle after obstacle in my path. He didn't want me to accept Mr. Adair, limited my allowance, and demanded an unreasonable marriage settlement. So yes, I admit I had reason, but I did not hurt him. I could not have, even if I wanted to. I have been at the Adairs since mid-afternoon. We have only just arrived home after the party." Her matronly companion nodded. "It is true. I was there with her all the while." "As was I," Mr. Adair added his assurance. Miss O'Toole shot him a scandalized look. "Not with her, Mr. Adair? Take care. You will give the men the wrong idea." "Of course not with her while she dressed for the evening. But in the house, yes. I spent time with my father and a nice bottle of Bordeaux, listening to his advice for a long and successful marriage." His fond gaze rested on Miss Lawrence, and he took her hand. The officer asked, "Then can you think of anyone else who held a grudge against Mr. Norris?" "Goodness," Miss Lawrence replied, "I don't think many people liked him. Pray forgive me, Mr. Hardy. I know he was your friend and law partner, but I can't think of anyone who'd actually harm him either, except—" "Except?" Her brow furrowed. "A man of business came here recently. The door was closed, so I didn't see him, but I heard him. He was clearly angry and raised his voice." "What was he angry about?" "He wanted Uncle Percy to invest in some scheme or other. I only listened at all because he mentioned Belle Island." "Do you know this man's name?" "I don't." "Did your uncle keep an appointment diary?" "Not that I know of." "I will search his desk just the same." Officer Riley made a note, then asked the servants, "One of you must have seen this man entering. Can any of you give me his name or description?" The housekeeper, maid, and manservants shook their heads. "Or the name of anyone else with something against Percival Norris?" Around the room, heads shook once more. Only Mr. Hardy remained still, eyes alight, Benjamin saw, with an idea, or a suspicion. He said, "I hate to speak ill of someone not present to defend herself, but Percival traveled to Belle Island recently, and he and Miss Wilder argued. He mentioned it to me with some concern." The officer turned expectantly to Miss Lawrence. The young woman shrugged. "It's possible. They sometimes sparred over management of the estate, but Aunt Belle hasn't come to London in years, and would not hurt a soul." "It's true, sir," the housekeeper agreed. Officer Riley considered. "Well, I'll make a note of it, although I shall start searching for a more likely Local offender first." The officer looked through his notes and seemed satisfied. "I think Constable Buxton has it right. A thief sneaked through the unlocked garden door, lifted a few pieces of silver, then entered the office, where he was surprised to find Mr. Norris. Norris reached for a pistol he kept in his top drawer, but before he could shoot, the intruder struck him with a hard object, perhaps one of the silver pieces in his possession." Officer Riley snapped shut his notebook. I will see if the missing silver turns up at any nearby pawn sellers. Could be we'll find our thief and kill her that way. For now you are all free to leave, though I reserve the right to call on you if further questions arise. Understood?" Around the room, heads nodded solemnly, and the servants filed out. Miss Lawrence bestowed a charming smile on the officer. "Actually, we are planning to travel tomorrow into Berkshire, near Maidenhead." "Leaving town? Why?" "My aunt was not able to join us for our engagement party here, so we are going to her. I hope we shan't need to delay our trip." She fluttered her lashes at the officer and asked tentatively, "May we please travel to Belle Island tomorrow?" The officer hesitated, his gaze lingering on the pretty young face. "I don't see why not. Berkshire is not so far away should I need to contact you again." "Excellent," Rose Lawrence beamed. "My aunt would worry were we delayed." He returned her smile, bowed, and walked from the room. Benjamin followed the officer into the corridor. "One flaw in your theory, Officer Riley. I noted signs of poisoning, but a thief would not bother with poison." The officer turned back. "If the coroner's inquest concludes the use of poison, I, of course, will pursue that then." As they walked down the back passage toward the scene of the crime, Benjamin saw something small and shiny on the carpet and squatted down to study it more closely. A garnet earring, the blood-red gem set amid small leaves of gold. Probably of no significance, but he pointed it out anyway. "Mislaid by Miss Lawrence, I'll be bound." The officer bent to retrieve it. "But I will show it to the coroner, just in case." He gingerly opened the office door, and Benjamin heard his brother's low voice pontificating within. As he slipped into the room, Riley turned back and whispered, "Now, good night." He winked. "Benish, Ben." Summarily dismissed, Benjamin hesitated near the garden door, vacillating about what to do. Mr. Hardy joined him there, and they watched as the servants disappeared in various directions, assumedly returning to their duties or going to bed for the night. Mr. Adair led Miss Lawrence into the corridor and said gently, "You had better stay with us tonight, Rose. It may not be safe here." Miss Lawrence managed a wobbly smile. "Thank you." Her companion nodded her agreement and started up the servants' stairs. "Give me 5 minutes to collect a few things for Miss Rose." With her chaperone out of sight, the young man stole a kiss. Benjamin averted his gaze and shifted foot to foot, feeling restless to be standing there doing nothing. "Shall we search the house? Take another look in the office?" He gestured toward the closed door. Mr. Hardy held up his hand. "Your brother would resent our interference. Perhaps even lodge a complaint." "True," Ben sighed. "But there must be something we can do. I am not convinced some unknown assailant is to blame." His mentor studied him, then ran a hand over his weary face. "You are not satisfied with that theory, and neither am I. You and I both know Bow Street officers rarely have time to be as diligent in tracking down offenders as we would like, especially if doing so would require them to leave the familiar comforts of London to search farther afield." "What are you suggesting?" "That there will be no justice for my friend if we don't do something. Did you notice the look that passed between Miss Lawrence and Adair? There is more going on here than they let on." "I did notice." "And now Riley has approved their request to leave town, to visit her aunt, Isabel Wilder, perhaps even to warn her." Warn her? Hardy nodded grimly. She not only argued with Percy when he was last there, but she also sent him an angry letter afterward. Benjamin felt his brows rise. Should we not have told the officer? The older man grimaced, the expression emphasizing his thin lips and long, narrow nose. Perhaps I should have done, but you saw how little interested Riley was in hearing about Miss Wilder. The letter would provide physical evidence of her resentment, if we had it. Where is it? Benjamin again gestured to the closed door. If it's in his office, then... Hardy shook his head. It's been destroyed. He read parts aloud to me, then in his anger wadded it up and tossed it onto the fire. Benjamin huffed. Why? What did she write? She disputed his management of their affairs and threatened to have him removed as trustee. Nothing illegal, but that sort of family drama becoming public would be irresistible to journalists, and I don't know that our firm can weather another scandal at present. Benjamin's stomach nodded. Because of my recent, very public failure. Hardy's expression gentled. I would not put it that way, my boy, nor would I raise the sore subject again if circumstances had not compelled me. But I cannot deny our reputation has suffered. We will recover, but the timing of another scandal coming to light now could not be worse. Percival's death will be bad enough. If my suspicions about Miss Wilder turn out to be baseless, we would have given the newspapers more fodder for nothing. Hardy paused, then added with resolve, if we find corroborating evidence to suggest she had a hand in Percival's death, then of course I would not hesitate to mention the letter. But as it is, I don't believe it worth the risk. Unless you think we should? Benjamin considered, then shook his head. Without supporting evidence, it would do us no good. It would be your word against Miss Wilder's. True. Hardy's expression brightened and he raised an aha finger. Except she does not know Percy destroyed it. As far as she knows, the letter is here among his many papers. Ah, Benjamin nodded, grasping the significance. And believing we have the letter, she will not deny writing it, and will perhaps admit to more as well. Hardy nodded, eyes narrowing in thought. Here's what I want you to do. Go to Belle Island, and quickly. Introduce yourself as a member of her uncle's firm. She won't suspect why you are really there. Leave as soon as possible so you arrive before the niece can give her any warning. Wait, you want me to go? Yes, Ben. I know you are not fond of travel, but it would be a great personal favor to me and to the firm. I can't get away at present, not with the Monkford case pending and Cordelia expecting any day. And you must admit it might be a relief to be out of town until the scandal and jests die down. True. It isn't far. You can go by stage as far as Maidenhead and hire a hack from there. Just show up on her doorstep? You know I have no reason to be poking about, asking questions. Of course you do. It's only professional courtesy that someone from our firm should deliver the sad news of his death in person and see if she requires any help with arrangements. Hardy warmed to the idea. Besides, if you are not the perfect person to go? You saw Officer Riley. Miss Lawrence has only to bat her lashes and he believes her every word and bows to her every wish. But you have learned a timely lesson. You are not apt to be taken in by a guilty female again, are you? Benjamin hesitated, clenching his hands behind his back to hide their tremble. Dread and rising duty warred within him. When he said nothing, Robert Hardy leaned near, pale eyes downturned, expression beseeching. When had so much silver invaded the man's sandy side whiskers? Will you do this for me, Ben? Percival was not a perfect man, I know, but he was my oldest friend. Benjamin thought of all the ways Mr. Hardy had helped him over the years, taking him on as an articled clerk when he was an inexperienced youth, teaching him and encouraging him. the older man had responded with resilient patience when his young protege made mistakes, and with warm praise when he succeeded. What balm and motivation both had been, when Benjamin had only known distance and cool disapproval from his own father. Would he suffer the discomforts of travel, leave the familiarity of London, where he'd lived all his 31 years, to help this man who had done so much for him, and in the bargain, maybe even bring a murderer to justice? Yes, he would. Well, there was a lot happening in this chapter. Servants definitely know more than they're letting on. There's gotta be something going on with those oranges. I'm not sure if oranges mask a poison or not, but we will find out.